Deputy Secretary, nice to see you again, and thank you for coming to visit us at the Economic Club of New York. I think before we get started and diving into deep policy questions, I think everybody's thinking the same thing I have. How can someone do all those things in a short amount of time? I feel like a slacker after hearing that bio, but I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of your background before we dive in. I mean, you've come from being born in Nigeria to being nominated in this position by the president and affirmed by the Senate. So people who kind of want to know your journey a little bit before we get started. So I know I'm embarrassing him. He doesn't usually like to talk about this, but I'm asking the question. So can you give us a little background on your journey?
It's great to be here, and thank you, Charles, for doing this. I know few people don't know this, but you were just in Ukraine hours ago when you came to do this, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the invitation. I got into public service because it's something that was important to my parents. We both immigrated to the United States from Nigeria. My dad was an elementary school principal, my mom was a nurse, and they both believed deeply in public service. And I had a chance to go to public university in California, UC Berkeley. It was the first year after the end of affirmative action. I got my first job in Washington, D.C., working for this man named Doug Elmendorf, who's now the president of, or the dean, excuse me, of the Kennedy School, but before that was friends with this guy named Tim Geithner, who ended up being Treasury Secretary.
Nice to have friends.
Yeah, good to have friends. And that's how I got introduced to Secretary Geithner at that point and ended up in the administration.
That's great. That's great. So my good friend Greg. Greg?
Thank you. First of all, Deputy Secretary, thank you for being here. Charles, riveting conversation, and President Van Allen, this is just I'm so glad to be here right now. So a question, in February of this year, I had an opportunity to travel with a delegation of leaders from across the country to Israel and Palestine. In Israel, I learned, I think 48 or something like that of the GDP is basically the technology sector. One thing that was explained to us that they do well is that they invest in companies investing outside of Israel. So here's what I mean by that. So I'm Jamaican. China has invested significantly in infrastructure in Jamaica. Highways, electricity plants, you name it. What is the secretary supposed to say differently? What is the Treasury doing with partners in government to make sure that businesses in the US are able to invest in places like continental Africa, the Caribbean, and so that it's easier for trade to go back and forth?
Good question. I think part of what we're doing is making sure that we're using the development finance arms of the government, like the Development Finance Corporation, to try and create real opportunities to invest in infrastructure in those countries, but also through things like the Export-Import Bank to help US firms that are competing to do business there. Ultimately, I think the difference between the way that we're doing this and China is doing this is that we want to end up in a place where countries have the ability to not only have these investments made there, but to reap more of the benefits of those investments that are being made so that it is a true partnership. We also don't think that the United States making these investments alone is the only strategy that we can undertake. That's why we've worked very closely with the G7 to do so. And to come back, I think the World Bank is going to play a major role here. The G20 meetings that just happened, one of the most important outcomes from there was outcome the president drove, which was increasing the capital for multilateral development banks by $25 billion, which will mean that these development banks are in a better position to make investments in middle income and lower income countries that will then unlock the ability of private capital to follow that. I think that when I talk to CEOs and I talk to investors, some of the things that they want to make sure that they're doing when they're going to these countries is making sure there's some degree of risk sharing between them, between the government, between international financial institutions. I think doing this well is going to be critical to unlocking potential in these economies, and that's what we want to do using things like the Development Finance Corporation. We're working in tandem with other countries like the UK and the European Union, as well as the World Bank, because I think in the same way that we see in America, there's plenty of potential in communities throughout this country. The question is, how do we create more opportunity? That's true in countries in the Caribbean, in Africa, Latin America, and we want to make sure that we're doing this in order to grow the global economy.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, let me thank you for attending. I think we all feel better with you at the helm about the country's balance sheet.
Thank you
Yes,
for
thank
having
you.
me.